HP Lion Roar PT-6. It took 2 weeks before they finally got word back from Victor Crumb. In that time, the Order was scouting for locations in which they could set up the perfect ambushes, far from Muggles, and would give them the greatest advantages. Everyone who was staying at the Flamel House was training to fight, or in the case of anyone under 16, learning how to help Molly Weasley with any wounded they might have when it was over. From sunup until sundown, everyone was training or planning for what they all hoped would be a serious turning point in the war. Yet the mood wasn't grim, or even tense. In fact, there was a growing excitement in the air. Nearly every night, everyone gathered around a lengthened table to share supper and just talk about anything. It was a true communal experience in many ways. Everyone helped everyone else, all of them working for a common goal. Voldemort's fall. Hermione commented one night that she was sure that it would be here that a new, stronger and better government would be born. After nearly 2 solid weeks on non-stop preparation, Mad-Eye Moody felt that it was time for everyone to take a break, and so he convinced Amelia Bones to order a day of rest. It was on this morning that Harry rose earlier than he had been. Despite the fact he was still recovering, he had taken part in all the training he could. He was often sent back to bed by someone, but as he got stronger, and was forced to retire a little later each day. Harry awoke just as the sun was rising over the eastern seaside, feeling Daphne's soft breath on his neck, where she had snuggled closer to him the night before. He smiled, and softly stroked her bare arm, loving the soft purr she made at his touch. As gently as he could, he slipped out from her embrace and snatched up a pair of shorts to cover himself. He was a bit surprised that he was awake at all at this hour, as the night before, Daphne had broached the subject of their hurried lovemaking. She had expressed concern that they weren't truly enjoying the experience each time because they were preoccupied by the war or something else. So Harry decided he would rather not talk about it, and spent the next 5 hours showing her that nothing else in the world mattered more to him than her happiness. He felt he could have gone a bit longer, but apparently, Daphne just couldn't keep up. Of course she blamed it on the fact that she had been training harder than he had been, to which he pointed out he was always sent back to rest. Still, in the end, nothing felt better to have the woman he loved fall asleep wrapped in his arms. As he looked at her, clutching the sheets where he had been a moment before, looking so utterly at peace, Harry was reminded once again why he was fighting at all when it would have been so much easier to run away. He could easily take Daphne and run far away, but he would be robbing others of moments like this, and Harry was positive that every single being deserved the happiness he was feeling right then. A light tapping on the bedroom window broke him from his moment of reflection, and he saw a very large barn owl staring at him with a large envelope. Harry softly opened the window and allowed the owl to come inside. He took the envelope and the owl left immediately, not even waiting for a treat or water. Harry slipped his fingers under the seal and took out the folded parchment. Harry, I have been wondering when you would write me again. I would have written myself, but you must have been hidden quite well. My owl could not locate you. Please do not expect your owl back for a few days. She was quite tired when she reached me. I am guessing she has not been out for a while. Do not fear, she is being taken very good care of. Much has happened since I last wrote you. As promised, I have been trying to recruit people to your cause, as my government did not wish to get involved. Much has changed. First off, and I still cannot believe it, I have raised an army, and it is well supplied. I must admit, I did not do this on my own. I was unaware of how well you are known in my country and in areas surrounding. We are all awaiting word to come and join you. I received the message, Galleon, and keep it with me at all times. You only need send us a location. Now for the best part. It seems that things between your new government and the governments of several countries are not well. From what I have gathered, war has been threatened on several occasions. This Dark Lord is promising that soon he will begin launching campaigns against other countries. I have it on very good authority that Bulgaria is now willing to lend you resources, though it would be in secret, unless war is actually declared. The International Confederation of Wizards is most anxious to avoid war. I am hoping you understand my meaning. Please send word soon. Your army is most anxious for this threat to be dealt with. Ever your friend, Victor. Oh hell yeah! Harry shouted gleefully, startling Daphne awake. She nearly tumbled off their bed as Harry leapt onto it to kiss her deeply, before tearing out of their bedroom shouting for everyone to awaken. Sirius was the first to make it to the sitting room, followed closely by Neville. One by one more and more residents finally appeared, all bleary-eyed and confused. Harry, for Merlin's sake, we were supposed to be allowed to sleep in. Tracy bellowed over the cacophony of voices. Harry noted that she and Susan were standing quite close, and the memory of what Daphne had told him popped into his head. He was a bit confused at why they wished to keep it a secret, but knew it was their business. "What's in your hand, Harry?" Neville asked, and Harry smiled, holding up the letter. "I just got this a few minutes ago," he said loudly, causing everyone else to quiet. 2 weeks ago, we were struggling to figure out how to make our plans work. Our wish is to cripple. Harry grimaced as he hated using this nomenclature for their enemy. You know whose forces in one fell swoop. Our problem was a lack of manpower, as many former members of the Order no longer wish to fight. We bear those people no ill will. Many of them, as well as some of you here, still have family inside Hogwarts. That problem has been effectively solved. We have an army. This is including help from Bulgaria's government and the International Confederation of Wizards. We've but to send the word. There was a long pause of silence as Harry's words sank in. Harry simply watched, waiting for the outburst he knew was coming. Sure enough, the entire house exploded in cheers. Hugs, handshakes and backpats were the order of the day as relief washed over every single person. What's our next step? Someone asked, and Amelia answered, calming the room with waves of her hands. First, I think it's critical we get all these people here to us. It will make things much easier if we're all in one place. Owls can be intercepted and things might get confused. This way, we'll be able to solve problems quickly. We'll need tents. I'm on it. Mad Eye Moody shouted, and tapped Fred and George Weasley to follow him out of the house. Harry, did Victor say how many people were coming? Amelia asked. Harry shook his head sadly, but Amelia didn't let that deteriorate her good mood. Well, I guess we'll find out when they all arrive. Go ahead and signal Victor that they should start coming right away. Tonks, Remus, we'll need to get plenty of food. Dobby can help with that, Harry remarked, and Amelia nodded and smiled her thanks. She began organizing groups for jobs in preparation of the new arrivals. Sirius went over to Harry, who offered the secret galleon. As Sirius was secret keeper, only he could give out the location of the Flamel house. Amelia began ordering people to various places to prepare for arrivals, while she sent others to set up food for everyone. It was 6 hours later before the first group arrived. The wards flared, and Sirius along with a few others ran out of the house, heading for the Port Kay arrival spot on the north end of the beach. Harry wanted to go with Sirius, but as they were not yet sure of what they were getting, and a bit of suspicion and worry had managed to grow regarding the trustworthiness of Victor Crumb, it was decided he should remain close to the Flu and an emergency Port Kay should they be betrayed. Sirius returned 15 minutes later along with a tall smiling figure Harry had not seen in far too long. Harry. Victor grinned as he clasped Harry's arm and pulled him into a friendly embrace. Victor was just as imposing a figure as he'd always been, though Harry was sure he was more muscular now. He'd grown a thin, well-trimmed beard, and allowed his hair to grow out a bit. He was flanked with several other imposing Bulgarians that Harry felt he should know. Victor, it's truly good to see you again. Thank you, for everything you've done for us. Think nothing of it. If one Dark Lord is allowed to rise, we all will be made to suffer in time. Many of my old school friends, as well as nearly everyone on my team were willing to help. We also found quite a bit of help within our ministry, and that was before the change of heart. I actually had to turn people away as they were too young or too old to fight. By the way, I have a gift for you. Victor turned, and a tall boy, that Harry thought he recognized as being a Durmstrang student that had been at Hogwarts during the tournament, stepped forward carrying a very familiar and rather upset-looking owl. I do not think she cares much for portkeys, the boy said, handing over Hedwig to Harry, who affectionately stroked her breast feathers and allowed the bird to nip his ear in welcome. It's very good to see you, girl. I'm so very proud of you. Hedwig puffed herself up and hooted with pride, before turning to Victor and narrowing her eyes at him. She deserves many treats for her courage, Victor said. And even more for having the indignity of being forced to travel by portkey. Hedwig lessened her glare and took off for a rest somewhere in the house. Victor, let me make introductions. Harry grinned, clasping the Bulgarian's arm again. The next 6 hours came with many more surprises. Victor had not been joking in his letter. While Bulgarians made up the bulk of the over 200 people who congregated on the island, there were also Austrian, Albanian, Spanish, and French Oros and hit wizards. This was made quite apparent when Fleur Delacour, Bill Weasley's fiancée, shrieked with joy when two men appeared along with Bill and Arthur Weasley. Papa! She leapt into the first man's arms and was twirled around shrieking in French. A little while later, when Fleur had managed to calm down, she introduced her father, Sebastian Delacour, and his lifelong friend, Laurent Boutin. Ah, Monsieur Potter, EET has been quite a long time since the tournament, no. EET is with great wonder that I am to inform you of the ICW's wish to seize this. How you say, problem. Dealt with all haste. We have brought no less than 28 wizards from Spain, France, and of course Italy. The Italians, or, if I may be so humble for my own nation, the best. Use them wisely. Mr. Delacour, I will never be able to express my sincerest gratitude to you or the ICW or any one of these people enough. Harry said, giving a bow. Sebastian and Laurent both bowed in return. Amelia stepped up, and it became clear that she was familiar with Sebastian Delacour. I can't believe this. Amelia shouted. You volunteered for this. She began leading them away, but not before Harry heard Sebastian say that there were rumors that she was not only alive, but leading the resistance alongside Harry. I'm just going to go get acquainted with our new guest, Sirius said, giving Harry a pat on the shoulder, and walking quickly to catch up to Amelia and her friends. Jealousy doesn't suit him at all. Daphne smiled as she sidled up next to Harry, who was standing on the porch watching people coming and going. Many of the newcomers were seeking out prime locations for their tents, while others were introducing themselves to members of the order, or fellow foreigner. Harry was surprised at the amount of camaraderie that was already happening, not to mention how quickly they had managed to get organized. Harry had already learned that they were making up squads, and putting together a sort of staff so that they wouldn't have to try and speak to everyone at once. I can't believe this is all happening. Daphne sighed, hugging her boyfriend, who smiled, and kissed her cheek lightly. If this works, the war could be over before Christmas. Christmas? Harry asked, appalled by her suggestion. Baby, I plan on ending this before the new school term begins. That's optimistic. Daphne smiled, liking Harry's enthusiasm. We have 2 Horcruxes left. With the sheer amount of support we have, we can double what we had initially planned. All that would be left is to storm the castle and end his life. Do you really expect him to stay there after he loses his army? I've already thought of that. Harry smiled. He kissed her once more and turned to head back into the house. Daphne stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what Harry was talking about. It suddenly occurred to her that he had more plans brewing. Plans he hadn't told her about. Harry Potter, you get back here this instant. I want you to reconsider. Hermione said softly as she sat next to Neville on the shore. The sun had only just fallen below the horizon, leaving the sky tinged crimson. Neville was staring serenely at the beauty of the sunset, reflecting on all he'd done in the last 2 years, not the least of which was making Hermione Granger fall in love with him. He smiled softly and took her slender hand in his and raised it to his lips, placing a long sweet kiss on her palm. It's suicide, Neville, and I won't let you do it, she said firmly, her voice wavering a bit. He could tell she was trying to appear stern, but he knew what she was feeling, because he was feeling it too. We've been over this, sweetheart. He smiled gently, turning to look at her. His heart skipped at the grave look of her beautiful face. Sacrifices need to be made. This is mine. There are other ways. Hermione argued. He'll probably be among all those Death Eaters we lure out. You know as well as I do that there's no guarantee of that. Neville said flatly, squeezing her hand comfortingly. I don't want you to go. Not alone. Not this way. Hermione said, her stern exterior crumbling away. I don't want to go either. But I've thought a lot about this, and I talked with Harry and we think. You talked with Harry? Hermione shouted, pulling away from her boyfriend. You talked to Harry about this and you two decided that this was the best course of action? I can't believe you two. She stammered, getting to her feet to head back to the house. Neville was on his feet and ran to stop her. I talked to you first, Hermione. I didn't do this behind your back, if that's what you're thinking. Yes, and as I recall, I told you back then there had to be a better way. Hermione struggled out of his grasp, anger clear on her face. I thought we had an agreement, Neville. I thought I meant more to you. Agreement? What agreement? Neville looked puzzled. Hermione's mouth opened in horror and she began to cry in earnest. Us, Neville. You and me. How can you have forgotten? You asked me just over there. She pointed toward a group of trees. Neville stared at her, his face still puzzled, and then it hit him all at once. He had all but forgotten, and now he felt ashamed of himself. His head sagged and Hermione came forward, grabbing the front of his shirt, forcing him to look her in the eye. You asked me to marry you right over there, she said through her tears. You said that you wanted to be with me for the rest of your life. To be my husband. Her voice was fading as her sorrow overpowered her. She fell into his chest and he wrapped his arms around her and held her as tightly as he could. I'm so sorry, Hermione. He said over and over again. I meant every word of it then, and I still feel that way right now. You are my whole reason for living and fighting. Every morning I wake up and see you curled in that tight little ball, I can't help but smile at how lucky I have been. But all of that changes nothing, and deep down you know that I'm right for once. It has to happen this way. It's the only way to ensure Harry gets that Horcrux and that you know who is finished. Then why do you need to go alone? Hermione tried. He won't be alone. You know he won't. Yes, he will. Neville said softly. Hermione slipped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer to her. Neville's heart hurt as he held onto the slender girl he loved so deeply. He's bound by the laws of the ancient and noble houses. They fell silent as Hermione let her tears stop on their own, Neville just holding her. She couldn't help but feel love for the man who held her. He was selfless and humble. He lived for her every moment of every day. As much as she hated it, she could not fault him for wanting to carry out this task, not just for Harry and the rest of the world. Not just for his parents. Not even for her, the woman he loved with his entire being. He needed to do this. For himself. That didn't mean she had to like it at all. Finally she began to pull away from him so that she could look him in the eyes. It hurt her very deeply to see the sorrow for what he was about to do in his eyes. She could tell that he was upset, only that he was disappointing her. I love you, she said, her head cupping his cheek. Neville leaned into her touch and sighed. I want you to know just how much you mean to me. Hermione, I've never once doubted your feelings for me. I've only doubted my worthiness of you. Well then I want to alleviate any lingering doubts you have before you go. Because I want you to come back to me. I want you at my side until we're very old, and have great, 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 great grandchildren. So, tonight. I want you to take me to bed, and I want you to make love to me until I pass out. Neville smiled and pulled Hermione to him, kissing her soundly, his fingers threading into her hair as he pressed her even closer. Before sweeping her up into his arms and carrying her back to the house, to their bedroom where he tore off every stitch of clothing on her slim body and devoured her for hours. Neville did not sleep that night. In fact, he stayed awake and watched Hermione sleep, stroking her hair and committing her image to memory. At 4:30, he slipped out of bed, dressed, grabbed his wand and slipped out of their bedroom. He had expected to slip away unnoticed, but he was very shocked to find Harry awaiting him in the kitchen. I thought I might have been staying awake for no reason. I actually hoped she might have been able to talk you out of it, Harry said in a near whisper. Neville sighed, and took a seat across from his friend. Harry, I want you to know that you've been the best friend I... Stop it. We're not doing this, Harry said, holding up his hand in protest. We're not saying goodbye today, Neville. I refuse to do it. Which is why I want you to take this. Harry slid something across the table into Neville's hands. Neville took the item and his eyes went wide with awe. Harry was giving him the sword that Sirius had gifted to him. Neville was truly grateful, but shook his head, attempting to give the sword back to its owner. Don't. Harry said. I want you to take it and drive it right into Ellie Strange's heart. This isn't me doubting your abilities, or thinking you're not going to make it back. This is me telling you, Neville Longbottom, to end the Lestrange line for all they've done to your family, to my family, and to every other wizarding family. This is me telling you to not mess around, or drag this out. You go and you end this thing as quickly as possible and you come back here and you marry Hermione and you get on with the life that is rightfully yours, do you understand me? Neville just stared into the burning emerald eyes of his friend and nodded slowly. They rose from the table together, and Harry went to the fireplace with Neville, giving his friend a tight embrace before offering him the Floo powder. I'll see you this afternoon. Neville smiled gently. And you'd better have good news to report. If you're not back by the time Sirius and I are, we're coming for you. Neville nodded and stepped into the fireplace. He dropped the handful of sparkling dust and said, "Longbottom Manor." In a flash of green flames, Neville Longbottom was gone. On his way to meet his destiny. Sirius was the first to step out of the flue, followed a moment later by Harry. The first thing they noticed was the stench of decay. "I thought so," Sirius said as he opened the little pantry door where Creacker's nest was hidden. There on a pile of very dirty blankets, surrounded by trinkets from all over the house, lay Creacker, stone dead, and decomposing. "Check out what he was hoarding, maybe he's got it?" Harry suggested, trying not to vomit from the smell. Sirius gingerly pulled out the blanket with Creacker's corpse and began sorting through all the heirlooms. There were fine silver goblets with the Black family crest, a jeweled box, a pearl necklace, that Sirius refused to touch with his hands. At least 10 different women's shoes which Sirius was certain had belonged to his mother, and a broken music box. "No locket," Sirius gasped, still trying to keep from gagging. "Before we leave, remind me to burn him." "So I guess we just do this the old-fashioned way." Harry shrugged, and headed out of the kitchen followed closely by Sirius. "We can start in Reeg's room, then spread out," Sirius said, heading up the stairs to the 3rd floor. "When are you going to tell me?" "Tell you what?" Harry asked, looking confused. "Where Neville went." Sirius looked over his shoulder. "I'm not an idiot, Harry. I could tell something was going on with him and Hermione yesterday, and whenever I saw you and Neville look at each other, you both seemed to tense up. Then there's the fact that you were up extremely early this morning, and let's not forget the concerto Hermione performed for all of us last night. I swear for being so bright, she can be quite forgetful. It isn't that hard to remember silencing charms." Harry snickered a little. "When this is over, Daphne's going to give her no end of grief for that. While we were still at Dumbledore's house, we were beginning to think they were forgetting them on purpose, just so we'd know when they were together." "I'm happy for you," Sirius said as he reached the 3rd floor. "For all of you. It's truly a gift to find someone you care for, and have them reciprocate those feelings. And if Neville comes back, I plan on giving those to a whole world of shit. So are you going to tell me?" Harry sighed and followed Sirius to the end of the hall and into a very ordered bedroom. "Your brother was kind of a neat freak, wasn't he?" Harry said, looking around. "No, he was just Creacker's favorite. Given the layer of dust, I'd say that elf's been dead a few months. Now spill it, boy." All right," Harry said, shaking his head at his godfather and turning to look through the desk. "Right after we saw Mrs. Longbottom, Neville got the idea to challenge Lestrange to a duel. Given what we learned about the vaults and all, and the fact that the last Horcrux is in there, Neville felt we need to get access to that vault." "Obviously." Sirius shrugged, emptying out the wardrobe. "So, he got in touch with Gringotts and with their help, wrote up a challenge contract. He invoked a lot of traditions, stuff I've never even heard of, and can't really remember, but all to ensure that it was just he and Lestrange. He kept it quiet because he knew that the more people knew, he'd have that many more people trying to stop him. Daphne doesn't even know." "So why'd he tell you?" Sirius turned to look at his godson, who turned and leaned against the desk he'd been searching. "Because he's sure he's not going to survive. His plan is to kill Lestrange, but he's sure it's going to cost his life to achieve that. So, he put an addendum in place. If both Neville and Lestrange die, both vaults fall to House Potter. He made sure I'd be able to get in and get the last Horcrux." Sirius looked as if someone had just run up and smacked him in the face with a raw fish. There was a long silence as the two men stared at each other before Sirius found his voice again. This war is costing far too much. We haven't even reached the apex and too many people, good people are dying. I'm afraid for him. But I have faith in him as well. In a way, I think he's been preparing himself for this all along. Harry admitted. To be honest, no matter what happens, I'm afraid for Hermione. She's so strong normally. She loves him so much, I just don't want anything bad to happen to him, for her sake. Sirius nodded sadly. I wish you guys had told me before this. I feel like I've let you all down somehow. In fact, all that time you guys were missing, I was constantly second-guessing all I'd done. I felt like I failed you all. How the hell did you come to that conclusion? Harry wondered. Guilt and self-pity. Amelia constantly reminded me that I'd done a very good job preparing you lot. You love her, don't you? Harry asked. Sirius sputtered for a moment before sighing and nodding his head. Come on, let's find this thing and get back. We still have loads to accomplish. Harry took a few moments to center himself. He hadn't done this since that night at the cave, and was worried that he wouldn't be able to do it again. Then again, there was the chance the Horcrux wasn't even here. That perhaps Sirius' brother had in fact managed to destroy it. When he opened his eyes again, he allowed his magic to reach out. He was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of residual magic within the house. He now understood why Dumbledore had taken him out of Hogwarts to train. Though he had managed to seek out that tiara in the room of requirement, he just had to filter out anything that didn't feel familiar to him. Harry began to wander about the house with Sirius on his heels. In each room he was searching out the familiar disgusting feel that Lord Voldemort's dark magic filled him with. Twice he felt that he was close, but in those rooms, Harry and his godfather found nothing. Still they continued. Harry was determined to find some sign of the Horcrux, though with each room, the chances of finding the damned thing decreased significantly. It was in the attic when Harry's shoulders sagged in defeat. I don't think it's here. Harry sighed. It was a shot. Sirius said, patting his shoulder. What could he have done with it? Harry asked, turning to follow his godfather back to the kitchen. Maybe he destroyed it? Sirius said flatly. That's a big maybe, Sirius, and I just don't feel like taking that chance. I know, Harry, I know. They entered the kitchen once again when Harry was suddenly hit with a wave of nausea. This time, it wasn't from the stench of Creaker rotting corpse. Sirius, it's here. It's in here somewhere. Harry had to grab the door frame to keep from falling over. And it's strong. Stronger than any of the others. I think it was one of his first ones. Where? Sirius asked, looking all over as if the Horcrux was going to jump out and wave at them. Harry rushed forward, going to his hands and knees and squirming into Creaker's hidey hole. It was quite dark, so Harry brought up his wand, lighting it so he could see. It was much smaller than the cupboard he had once lived in, and far more disgusting. There was a stench of urine mixed with decay, and Harry dry heaved for a minute. He moved the wand all around in every corner, searching for the Horcrux he was sure was hidden somewhere in this tiny little pantry. Yet there was nothing. It was empty save for some maggots that had likely been feasting of Creaker. Frustrated, Harry shouted and pounded his left fist into the wall. And that's when it happened. Harry never would have seen the little hole, it had been covered so well. But Harry's fist broken through the thin stone that hid the little pocket inside the wall. Gently, removing his hand, Harry aimed his lit wand into the hole, and there, laying on a dirty handkerchief, was the locket that had once belonged to Salazar Slytherin. Harry reached up, and started to grasp the locket when it suddenly shivered. Harry drew his hand back, startled by the bizarre behavior of the seemingly innocuous object. "It's afraid," Harry said to himself. "It knows it's in danger." "Harry!" Sirius called. "I found it," Harry said, once again reaching up to take the locket. His fingers clasped the chain and slowly he freed the locket from its prison, before slithering out of Creacker's pantry. "He'd hidden it in the wall," Harry said as he stood up and set the locket on the table. "Rather unimpressive looking, isn't it?" Sirius commented. "That's the beauty of these things. No one would ever suspect that something so sinister was inside." "So how do we destroy it?" Sirius asked. "With this." Harry smiled, pulling the sword of Gryffindor out of a small pouch he'd had in his pocket. When Sirius looked like he was about to inquire, Harry simply smiled and said, "Hermione." "Ah." Sirius nodded his understanding. "Shall we get on with it?" "Hold the chain. It knows it's in danger," Harry said, heaving the sword over his head. Sirius grabbed the chain, attempting to keep his hands out of the way. Harry brought the sword down, and just as he was about to cleave the Horcrux, it skittered out of the way. "You're joking," Sirius remarked, letting go of the chain and shaking his hand like it had just been dipped in something truly foul. "We'll be at this all damned day," Harry groaned. He took a step back to try and think of something. He stared at the locket for several moments before his gaze locked onto the serpent S on the front. "I have an idea," Harry said, handing the sword to Sirius. "I'm going to open it. When I do, stab it." "Okay." Sirius shrugged. He readied himself, aiming the point of the sword right over the locket. Harry stared at the locket, and took a deep breath before hissing in Parseltongue. At once the locket popped open, and Harry and Sirius found themselves staring at a pair of sinister red eyes. Sirius didn't hesitate. He slammed the sword right through the locket and through the table before the cursed thing could try and escape again. There was a blast wave that knocked both men away and an unearthly scream echoed throughout the black house. Harry's head knocked into a large cabinet and several plates fell, smashing on the floor and his head. Sirius was a bit luckier, his back taking most of the abuse as he slammed into the wall. From the hall, Mrs. Black's shrieks echoed those of the Horcrux. Sirius ignored the portrait as he got to his feet to check on his godson, who was rubbing his bleeding head and slowly sitting up. "Did we do it?" Sirius asked, helping Harry to stand. Harry looked at the smoldering locket and sighed. "Yeah. It's destroyed." Harry smiled. Sirius sighed as well, before reaching over and tugging the sword of Gryffindor out of the table. The locket fell onto the floor with a light clatter, and Harry went around to collect it. "Why are you taking it?" Sirius asked. "I want to give it back to you-know-who." "I think he'll appreciate it." Harry smiled wickedly. "Are you sure about that?" Sirius chuckled. "Let's get out of here," Harry said, looking around the kitchen and lingering on Creacker's body. "Sure thing. Let me just do one thing." Sirius grinned, walking out to where the portrait of his mother was shrieking like the damned. Harry followed, his curiosity growing with every step. "Betrayer. Shame of my loins. Goodbye, mother." Sirius laughed, aiming his wand. "Incendio." The portrait burst into flames. Sirius threw his head back laughing as he stepped back and watched the maniacal portrait burn. "I think you have a few issues to work out," Harry said as Sirius grabbed him by the shoulder and began leading him back to the kitchen and the flue. "Like you could resist doing something similar if it were a picture of the Dursleys," Sirius remarked. Harry stared at Sirius a moment before relenting, causing Sirius to laugh even harder. "Wait, should we just leave with the fire burning like that?" "Don't worry. The wards will keep any damage inside the house. The Muggles are safe." "Bit irresponsible, isn't I?" "Harry, I would tear this place down to the foundations. I will be very happy to never set foot in this hell so long as I live. Now, if you don't mind, I'd really like to go home now." Harry nodded, and as Sirius set Creaker's corpse aflame, they stepped into the fireplace and activated the flue back to Flamel House. Sirius was extremely happy that he would never see that house again. Nothing he had ever felt was as liberating as staring his mother in the eye and lighting her on fire. Though his real mother wasn't nearly as nice as the portrait, it had still been freeing. For the rest of his life, whenever he would think about his last act, he would fall into fits of crazed laughter that would sometimes worry friends and family. Neville stepped out of the flue at his family home. He was immensely tense, and his grip on Harry's sword tightened. He knew he had a few hours until Lestrange was supposed to show up, and Neville figured he would prepare himself. He already had a pretty decent advantage. He'd grown up on these grounds and knew them quite well. If he needed to get away from Lestrange to catch his breath, he knew of a handful of places he could slip into. And while he planned to keep the fight outside, if they wound up in the house, he'd truly have the upper hand. He glanced around the sitting room where his grandmother could usually be found reading, or poring over new bills being introduced in the ministry. She'd been a very stern and strict guardian, yet, at times, she could be quite kind. In her way. Neville gave a slight chuckle at that thought. He remembered how she'd looked at him the last time they had spoken. She had been proud. She'd been quite pleased with him, and she'd like Hermione as well. He hoped that she would be proud of him when this day was over. He was suddenly overcome by the desire to see his bedroom. He dashed up the ornate spiral staircase and down the hall to the room he'd spent his years growing up in. It was just as he'd left it 2 years ago when Dumbledore came to retrieve him. There was a letter from Hermione that he'd gotten that day on his desk, right where he'd left it. He'd only just finished reading it when his grandmother called him downstairs where Dumbledore was waiting. Only 2 days after Ron Weasley's funeral. Neville went to the desk and reverently picked up the letter and read it once again. "Neville. It's only been a day and I find myself missing you so terribly. So much happened this year that when I look back, it seems impossible that it all happened in 1 year. We lost a great friend. We fought a battle that most fully qualified wizards wouldn't have walked away from. We rebelled against our own government. And most important of all, we found each other. I have to admit to you that when Ginny first blurted out that you fancied me, I was truly gobsmacked. But I'm happy that she exposed your secret. If she hadn't, I don't think I would have found the courage to kiss you that day we played football. I guess what I'm saying is that I'm truly thankful that it's you in my life. I love you, Neville, and I can't wait until we're together again so I can say it to you directly. I'm going to ask my parents if you can come over for a bit during the holidays. I don't like the thought of waiting to see you for 3 months. Write to me soon. Love. Hermione." Neville sighed deeply as he folded the letter and stuffed it into his pocket. He hadn't really needed the reminder of Hermione's feelings for him, but somehow, he garnered more strength from her written words. The memory of their love-making the night before emboldened him a bit, and he checked the clock that rested by the bedside table to check the time. Still 2 hours at least. Neville decided that it would be best to try and give himself a few more advantages. Heading out to the greenhouses that had occupied much of his time during past summers, he scanned the untended and in many cases, dead plants for anything that he might use in the coming fight. Neville had thought long and hard about this day. He knew that Lestrange was one of the enemy's most powerful soldiers, and he also knew how the man loved inflicting pain. He'd been married to the most sadistic woman Neville had ever heard of. Bellatrix Lestrange. Neville was sure that Rodolphus Lestrange would fight very dirty. There was no honor in that man. Then again, Neville felt the man deserved no honor in their coming duel. He'd been given Harry's sword, and the greenhouse, as barren as it appeared to be, had yielded a few tentacular leaves, which he could crush into a powder and if he got close enough, throw into Lestrange's face. Neville knew a good handful would temporarily blind his foe as well as make it difficult to breathe for a bit. He also found 2 pods from a snargaluff plant. The sap within the pods would make any flesh it touched swell up to balloon proportions. If Neville could get some on Lestrange's hands, his opponent would have a very difficult time holding a wand. Neville got to work on the tentacular leaves and placed the pods in his right pocket. Once the leaves were nothing but a fine powder, Neville conjured a small vial and carefully poured the powder inside before corking it. There was nothing left to do but to go to the front of the house and wait for his destiny. At exactly 10, Neville heard the distinctive pop of apparition, and from the front steps of his family home, he saw the front gates open, and the distinctive black robes of the Death Eaters. Neville felt a small wash of relief as he could see that the figure was alone. Lestrange had apparently kept to their contract. Lestrange was slightly taller than Neville, though much more broad in the chest. He lowered his hood, and Neville got a good look at the last living person responsible for his mother and father's madness. His cold brown eyes were a bit sunken, with deep black circles, like he'd not slept in months. He looked thinner somehow, compared to the last time they had seen each other in Daphne Greengrass home. His chin was covered by a thick stubble of a beard, and his wand was already drawn, clutched tightly in his thin fingers. Longbottom. Lestrange snarled. I'm surprised. Neville said, getting to his feet and drawing his own wand. I was sure you'd come with friends, too afraid to face me alone. I don't need any help to kill a squib. Lestrange snapped, menace in his cold cruel eyes. This squib killed your brother and your wife. Both men began to circle unconsciously. Neville raised his wand just as Lestrange did, keeping himself ready to dodge, as he was positive there'd be no warning. As far as Neville was concerned, the duel had started. Not as a wizard. Lestrange snapped angrily. You stabbed them. Fought like a filthy animal. A muggle. You're no wizard. You're meat. Lestrange's wand flicked, and a bright orange blast shot out at Neville, who bent backwards to dodge the hex. He returned fire with 2 hexes of his own. Lestrange already had conjured a shield however, and he was able to absorb Neville's volley. Lestrange began to laugh but Neville merely narrowed his eyes. Is that the best you got, boy? No wonder you had to cheat. Bellatrix did as well. If you remember, I killed her with her own knife. Lestrange's laughter died. His lip curled and he glared at Neville. Lestrange snapped his wand at Neville and the same bright orange spell rushed out towards Neville, who again leapt out of the way. That was when the duel changed. Neville had only barely landed on his feet when Lestrange began giving chase, firing spell after spell after spell. Neville ran away from Lestrange, doing his best to weave and dodge, trying his best not to make himself an easy target. Through it all, Neville knew it was just a matter of time. The ground behind him exploded, and he felt himself lifted into the air, spinning head over heels to land hard behind a large hedge. Neville heard Lestrange laughing as he closed in on his prey. Neville groaned as he rolled onto his stomach and heft himself up onto his knees. He felt a wave of dizziness for a moment, and shook his head to clear it. Nice trip, Longbottom. Lestrange cackled as he drew closer. Neville quickly got to his feet, keeping low. He had the hedge between himself and Lestrange, and that gave him a bit of an edge. He tightened his grip on his wand and moved along the hedge grove, careful not to disturb it, giving himself away. As Lestrange rounded the corner, Neville was waiting for him. "Sectum sempra," he called out. "Not this time, Squib," Lestrange bellowed, ducking out of the way of the spell. He flicked his own wand, but Neville was already moving, and a huge hole was blasted in the hedge. "Get back here and die like a man," Lestrange shouted. "You first," Neville replied, firing 3 hexes which Lestrange ducked and shielded himself against. That's when Neville first noticed it. Lestrange was tiring. He wasn't fully healed from Hermione's hex. Neville wasn't sure how that was possible. It had been a month. He should be right as rain, especially with healers and such under Voldemort's control. But who was he to question these things? Neville now realized he had another advantage. Lestrange threw another volley of spells at Neville, which he managed to dodge, some only just barely. Yet Neville felt if he kept Lestrange moving and casting, he'd tire, and Neville would be able to finally end it all. Dip indo. Neville knew his luck wasn't going to hold forever. Lestrange had finally drawn first blood. Neville launched himself behind the fountain to give himself a moment to see how badly he'd been hurt. Thankfully it wasn't a deep cut, and it was only on his bicep, but it was still first blood. "What's the matter, Squib? Do you have a boo-boo? Would you like me to fetch your mummy so she can kiss it all better?" Lestrange cackled. Neville's blood began boiling at the mention of his mother. He reached up under his jacket to make sure the sword Harry had given him was still secured there. He had cast a sticking charm to the sheath and placed it on his back and then shrank it a bit so it was hidden under his jacket. The sword was still there, but Neville decided not to use it just yet. At least not until he'd drawn a little of Lestrange's blood. "Come on, Squib," Lestrange shouted, his voice much closer. Neville realized he'd made another mistake. He'd given the man a chance to rest, to catch his breath. He popped up from his hiding spot and snapped off 2 bombardment spells before running again. He heard Lestrange shout, and chanced a look over his shoulder. Apparently Lestrange had been much closer than he though, and his spell had actually hit the man's left arm. Blood was pouring down from a gaping wound, and the man's arm was hanging rather limply. Lestrange stuck his wand right in the hole and cast a fire spell, cauterizing it, and screaming in pain. Neville spun on his heel, nearly losing his balance all tighter. He raised up his wand and fired a stunner, which Lestrange somehow managed to avoid. Neville's frustration began to build as he began moving closer to his fallen enemy. He stopped suddenly when he realized what was happening. Lestrange was playing possum. He was trying to lure Neville in closer for the killing strike, and Neville was walking right into it, like a prat. "I'm not falling for this one, you maggot," Neville shouted, his wand held steady. "You're going to have to earn it, bootlicker. I'll show you bootlicking." The voice was behind him. Neville turned and felt something hard connect with his jaw. Neville fell back onto the ground and rolled just as another bright orange hex blasted the grass where he'd just been lying. On his feet again, Neville charged and was rewarded when he heard the air being forced out of Lestrange's lungs. The 2 men fell in a tangle of arms and legs. Neville tried to get his wand tip pointed at Lestrange while the much stronger man did the same. Both of them clawed, punched, and spit at each other, trying to get better leverage over the other. Neville even tried to get his hands around the man's throat, but Rudolphus punched Neville's stomach. After that they both focused on their wands and trying to hit the other with something. Sparks flew out, singing the earth as the two men continued to struggle. "Why won't you just die?" Rodolphus snarled, spit flying from his mouth and splashing coldly on Neville's face. "I've been waiting for you to show me how it's done, you son of a bitch." Lestrange brought his knee up and landed a hard kick into Neville's kidneys at the same time, wrenching his arms out of Neville's grasp and rolling away. Neville felt like he was going to throw up, but he still forced himself to move as quickly as he could manage. He got to his feet and tripped to his knees at once. He glanced down and saw that the sword had been torn off his back, as part of his shirt was still attached to the sheath. "A sword?" Lestrange asked, looking at Neville. "You fancy yourself a swordsman, do you? What was your plan, boy? Get in close and stab me through the heart like you did my wife and brother." "Actually, I stabbed your wife through her throat. She wouldn't shut up." "Avda Kedavra." Neville leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding the killing curse. He knew that his original plan was pointless. He was getting tired now, and needed to catch his breath. Of course it would give Lestrange the same much-needed break, but if he didn't get a moment to rest, he was going to die. "Where are you going, boy?" Lestrange bellowed as Neville stormed into his house. It was huge, and it would take a bit of time for Lestrange to find him. Neville ran as fast as he could up the stairs all the way into the attic. There was only one entrance, and he would be able to hear Lestrange coming long before the bastard even spotted Neville. Ducking behind several large trunks, Neville tried his best to steady his breathing. He checked his arm and saw the cut he'd gotten from Lestrange's stiff indo was already scabbing. It hadn't been too bad. What was worse was the Neville's left eye was swelling shut. Slowly he began gaining back his breath. He decided he needed a new plan. He did have an advantage over Lestrange. If he could keep the man moving and casting, he would tire quickly. The problem was that, as Neville had discovered, Lestrange would manage to get a spell or two in, and Neville didn't want to risk that spell being something serious. Several noises caught Neville's attention. It sounded like every single door being slammed shut, including the attic door. Neville got up and saw that indeed the door had been closed. Neville went to the door, still breathing heavily, and reached out to grasp the latch, only to be burned. What the hell? Longbottom. Neville turned and rushed to the window and looked out, careful not to reveal himself. He could see Lestrange staring up from the grounds, looking triumphant. "Since you're too cowardly to face me like a real wizard, then I'll simply have to kill you another way. I killed hundreds of families like this. I only wish I'd brought some food. Nothing tastes better like a rabbit roasted over an open flame." With that, Lestrange flicked his wand in several directions. Neville now understood what had happened. Lestrange had sealed the doors and was now igniting the house on fire. Now how is that fair? Neville balked at the stupidity of it all. He rushed back to the door and tried a few spells trying to unlock the door so he could get out. Nothing worked. He could already feel heat building, and faint traces of smoke began to seep under the door. Something's not right here, Neville thought. The fire was spreading far too quickly, and heating up far faster than seemed plausible. He heard explosions of glass from somewhere deep in the house, and more smoke began pouring into the attic from different places. "Aguamenti," Neville said, aiming his wand at the floor, hoping he might somehow cool down the attic, or even put out the fire, but the water had barely left his wand tip when it evaporated. "No," Neville said in disbelief. "Fiend fire." Fear gripped Neville's heart then. Fiend fire was an intensely hot and fast-burning flame, which often took form of some sort of creature, consuming whatever was in its path in mere moments. Most magical people didn't dare use it as it was very difficult to control. Neville remembered hearing a story his great-uncle had once told him about a man who had used fiendfire to clear away a field of brush and nearly destroyed a whole city in America. The fire had eventually been blamed on a cow or something, but Neville never forgot the story. Neville went back to the window. He was 3 stories up, and there was nothing soft to break his fall. Okay. I never ever tell Hermione about this, he vowed before taking a few steps back. Neville turned and readied himself. Taking a deep breath, he was about to begin running when part of the floor gave out and a tongue of flame shot up through the floor, igniting nearly everything on fire, including Neville's clothing. Screaming, Neville fell to his knees, struggling to tear off his jacket to keep from burning alive. Flinging off the garment, Neville shot forward, crossing his arms in front of his face, and leapt out of the attic window. As he fell, Neville tried to angle himself so that he would do the most damage to his legs. The ground came rushing up to meet him and then fell away again. Neville actually bounced off the bounce and into a mess of bushes. Neville was thoroughly shocked to find that not only was he in one piece, but that was unhurt. At least he was sure he hadn't been hurt. Memories of being thrown out a window when he was younger came flooding into his mind. He began to chuckle softly as he extracted himself. Accidental magic? Really? He laughed, collecting his wand. All laughter died when the bushes went up in flames, causing him to stumble backwards. I knew I'd get you to face me if I lit that hovel on fire, Lestrange was shouting as he ran forward. His eyes were narrowed slits, and he looked completely psychotic. Neville's mind flashed on a similar mask of bloodlust 2 years before, when Bellatrix had straddled him, preparing to end his life. Neville's wand came up and he shouted a bombardment spell, just as Lestrange did the same. The spells impacted each other, and the shockwave blasted the combatants off their feet. Neville's head struck a tree, while Lestrange was knocked head over heels, landing on the stone walkway near the fountain. Both men were on their feet in an instant. Lestrange was no longer interested in ending the fight quickly, as had been his original goal. He was surprised at Longbottom's aptitude. The boy had certainly more power than many believed. Lestrange hadn't faced a competent opponent in such a long time that he felt rejuvenated, though he was very tired and still weak from his time in the infirmary. Now that he was out and fighting, he was more sure than ever that Snape had been doing something to his potions. Once he finished this fight with Longbottom, he intended to make Snape suffer and reveal him for the traitor he knew the greasy coward to be. For now, however, he felt it was time to make the boy suffer. Longbottom was shaking his head, obviously trying to clear the cobwebs. Lestrange took advantage and sliced the air several times. Deep cuts appeared on Longbottom's chest, and the boy cried out with each new wound. "I want you to cry like the child you are, boy. Scream for me. Crucio." Neville launched himself behind the tree he'd struck with his head to avoid the torture curse. He only just avoided it, and he thanked whoever was watching out for him. Knowing he wouldn't last long behind the tree, however, Neville took the fight to Lestrange. It was like a scene from some long-forgotten epic painting. The two combatants facing each other while a great fire blazed behind them, nearly encircling them as the fiendfire began to grow and get out of control. Neville did his very best to think of every sinister spell that Sirius Black had taught him, while Lestrange countered with his vast knowledge of dark magics. They danced and leapt, neither bothering to raise a shield, as it would have been counterproductive to their fight. Closer and closer they drew to each other as the intensity of their spell work grew more and more deadly. But then, Lestrange shocked Neville, and disarmed him. Neville had been so stunned by the sudden shift, that he was unable to dodge, and his wand slipped from his hand. Neville only faltered a second. Thankfully, Lestrange was gloating, and didn't press his sudden advantage. It was the opening Neville needed. He shoved his hand into his pocket and grasped the vial of tentacular powder, and unstoppered it before darting forward and throwing the powder right into Lestrange's eyes. Lestrange lashed out, firing a cutting hex which caught Neville's shoulder. Neville tripped over something, and fell hard to the now roasting ground. The flames were growing closer and closer now, and Neville knew he had only one chance. Lestrange howled in agony, clawing at his eyes and cursing Neville's name. He fired spell after spell in every direction, hoping to kill the boy once and for all. Neville kept low as he turned to face Lestrange, all the while thinking of what he could do. Lestrange still had his wand. He was weaponless. That is, until he found Harry's sword, still lying on the ground near the fountain, not 10 feet away. Smiling, Neville slithered for the sword, and clutched it up in his hands. It had reverted back to its full length, the shrinking charm having faded. Neville unsheathed the blade, admiring the way it gleamed in the firelight and the sun. Lestrange was still spinning and screaming and tearing at his eyes. Blood was now pouring down the man's face from where his fingernails had torn into his face. Neville stood, and raised the blade, preparing to strike. He began to move, and everything felt like it slowed to a crawl. Closer and closer he drew to finally ending the life of one of the men who had tortured his parents and robbed him of their influence. He was nearing the end of his war at last. Then he felt his chest suddenly rip open. His feet slid out from under him and he fell onto his back. He managed to cling to the sword, but his body began to seize up with the pain. His slide took him right in front of Lestrange, who was finally managing to regain his sight, at least enough to see that Neville was before him. Neville stared in horror at the gaping wound in his chest. Blood was flowing out onto his clothes and now staining the ground around him. He began to shake as he realized exactly what had happened to him. Lestrange had learned and used the Sectum Sempra spell. Lestrange glared down at him, his wand aimed right at his face. "I'm going to watch you bleed out, just like the stuck pig you are, Longbottom. Then I'll throw your died-out corpse into the fire." Neville glared hard at the man. Gripping the sword as tight as he could, Neville slashed it across his body, cutting Lestrange's hand clean off at the wrist. Rudolphus Lestrange fell to his knees, staring blanking at his fallen limb. Neville struggled to his own knees, feeling his life draining out of him. He wasn't sure how much longer he had, but he planned to make the most of it. Just as Lestrange turned to look at him, Neville had raised the sword, and just as he'd promised Harry, shoved it right into the man's throat. Then everything began to blur, and he felt himself falling. Neville was sure that he heard someone calling to him from far, far away as blackness crept in and embraced him. So caught up in their battle were Neville and Rudolphus, that they did not hear the multiple pops of apparition, or notice the wall of fiend fire began to die out. Nor did either man see the faces of the newcomers as they witnessed the very end of the battle. Sirius Black, Bill Weasley, Remus Lupin, Tonks, and Mad Eye Moody had immediately tended to reining in the fiend fire. It was slow going, but the three men were quite accomplished wizards, and in the end, were able to put out the magical fire once and for all. Amelia Bones led Harry, Daphne, and Hermione towards the fallen combatants. Hermione shrieked in horror when she saw how bad her beloved was, and begged for someone to do something to help him. Fortunately, Harry bounded into action, as he was the only one there who knew the counter spell for the Sectum Sempra spell. Harry closed his eyes and summoned all his power and concentration to close Neville's chest. Hermione held onto her lover and watched as Harry's wand traced a slow line up Neville's torso and knitted the flesh back together. She held his hand in hers, softly begging Neville to open his eyes and let her know he was still there. When the fire was put out, Sirius led the others to surround Neville and Hermione, as Harry continued his work. Amelia tore herself away to go check on the other body. Lestrange lay on his back, propped up by the sword sticking his throat. His eyes were wide, and he was choking on his own blood. Amelia saw that his wand hand lay a few inches in front of him, his wand still clutched in its grip. The former head of the DMLE bent and snapped the wand before getting to her feet once again. Rodolphus Lestrange, I hope that every demon in hell gets orgasmic pleasure in inflicting every sadistic torture upon you for all eternity, you bastard. With that, she reached out to take hold of the sword hilt and twisted it hard. There was a sickening crunch as the blade ground against Lestrange's spinal cord. His eyes went wide and there was a gurgle and more blood spilled from his throat. Then, slowly, his breathing fell silent, and his eyes fell closed. Amelia spat on the man's face, and tugged the sword out. Well done, son. Moody complimented as Harry rocked back on his heels. You got to him just in time. His pulse is weak, but it's there. He's alive. Hermione asked, tears streaming down her face. Aye, lass. Moody nodded. We need to get him back and start getting blood replenishes in him. Sirius, Weasley, give me a hand. Bill Weasley levitated Neville, while Sirius conjured a stretcher. Neville was strapped to the stretcher, and Moody placed a charm on it that would protect the patient and keep him from getting jostled during apparition. He and Bill then operated away. Come on, Harry. Daphne said, helping a very tired Harry to his feet. Sirius took hold of Hermione, who was now almost paralyzed with worry and despair. Harry saw how desperately frightened Hermione looked, and hated it. He wanted to do something, anything to ease her suffering, but he knew it was all useless. He looked at Daphne, whose face mirrored his own broken heart, and she gave his arm a gentle squeeze. All right. Amelia shouted to the remaining order team. Let's get out of here. And with a few loud cracks, Longbottom Manor was left silent once again. The once fine manor and grounds were now nothing more than a charred ruin. Please like and subscribe.